How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. How you doing?
I'm
I'd
doing
be
fine,
curious what you're
beautiful
thinking
one.
about,
How?
my friend. And Javier, good to see you, sir. I'd be curious what's been going through your mind. Mr. Rivera, good to see you, sir. You've been killing it on Substack lately, my friend. You've been blowing it out the water. My goodness. And Dimitri, the one and only. How you been, Javier?
Good, good. Finally, I think going to school really proves your theory about necessity because when you don't have time, you realize that writing will never happen. So, versus when you have all the time, you discover writing never happens anyways. You know? So, yeah, I've been really astonished by the fact that my productivity has sort of gone through the roof because of the fact that if I don't find a time or way to write, then it'll just never happen because there's definitely enough excuses in the world to say writing will never happen at this point if I continue.
No, that's a really funny thing, Mr. Rivera, and I'll throw it to Dimitri here. It is funny how there's always good reason not to, and then when you can, there's still good reason not to. And how I think you just have to be captured by the idea, right? There has to be a certain sense of necessity in the idea to do it, and then just a decision to do it, as opposed to looking to the opportune time, right? Because the opportune time is not there. It also helps me to realize that when you write, it's not really about the amount you write, it's about the insight, right? Like, does anyone care that, some of Dickens' poems are only a few paragraphs, right? Yeah, that poem's not long. Rilke, that poem's not long enough to be quality or anything, right? Nobody really cares about that or anything. So but it's good to see you again, sir. Dimitri, how are you doing today, sir? Please, it's good to see you.
Yeah, I second you, Javier. For some reason, I always want to say Javier. That's like a French way to say it, but I know it's not right. But even though I've known you for years, I still have the tendency to say it. I don't know if that's something psychoanalytic going on. I don't know if that's something phonological going on. I don't know if it's morphological. I don't think it's syntactical. But I don't know. I'm lost. So yeah, but I second you. Like I'm at uni and oh man, I'm such I'll just come out in the clear. So I will I'm an addict, like I like smoking hashish and I've been doing that since I was 15 years old. But I've like I went to a friend and this friend of mine, he's a Muslim and we go to the gym together. And Ramadan started and I told him, dude, I'm gonna give you my last stuff and and like whenever I want it, I'll just have to ask you to do it. But I know I will never do that because I'll feel weak for asking that. And since I've done that, I've actually not been smoking that shit for a few days now, but the plan is to do for months. So, and I'm feeling so good. I'm feeling so good. So I'm getting way more done. And yeah, yeah. So there's is the thing about time is all. I mentioned this before in a podcast with Cadell, is that Freud says the one of the definitions of the unconscious could be fixation. So we're not really aware of how much time we spend on fixating. For example, I will just give some personal examples here. So one of the things I like to do is I like when I find a good song, I'll just put it on repeat for like hours on end. It's madness, and it's a kind of fixation. But eventually, I'll be sick of it and I'll go to the next thing. But it could be anything, right? It could be sexual fixation, or it could be um, yeah, it could be anything. So I think a big part of my work as like like psychoanalytically informed philosophy is like loosening up fixations. And how do you do that? That's not an easy question to answer at all. But I think one of the ways that I try to do that um, is really to try to think through fantasies and to see what's the anxiety undergirding it. And because if you think through this anxiety undergirding it, it's harder to make up excuses, right? Excuses to not begin writing, for example, or excuses not to go to the gym, or excuses not to stop your addiction, or I feel like all these, and like excuses also in the form of emotions, right? Excuses in the form of, oh, I'm just too stressed. Excuses in the form of, oh, I'm too sad, or even I have something else going on, or whatever. So these are, yeah, things I've been thinking about, and yeah, but it's not only like philosophy or psychoanalysis. I think the arts are huge here. Like actually working on an art project, sitting on it, digesting it and going back and back and back to it and then releasing it. Okay, so I'll just give another anecdote. So today, because I'm gonna do a podcast with Mikey Downs soon, I was just going through. I just made a list of all my what I call my main writings throughout the years. So I would say like part of that is on Substack, and then the other part would be the Philosophy Portal anthologies. And when I wrote them all down, all these papers starting from 2022, and then every year there's some stuff. I looked at it with disgust. I was like, bruh, these titles are so shit. These are horrible titles. I thought, like, what am I doing? But no, I mean, it's good. It's good work. It's good work. I'm so glad that I did the work. But I had this moment of just feeling like it was ridiculous what I did, and I think that's actually a good measure of success. So that's actually a measure of you being able to move on to the next project. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So it's not about like uh, very easily writing a Magnus Opum, or oh, I could write that, or I could do this, and oh, I understand things quickly. I'm saying this because that's kind of the uni mindset of, oh, that's easy, and I can do it fast. But no, it's like, are you actually willing to take things so arduously slow that it's painful to the extent that you'll have to face yourself and see kind of the shit that you produce at the end of it. And I think that's the move from, to speak in Zizek's, the move from sublime to excremental. So that's the object A. The object A is like the sublime object of ideology. It's like, oh, what is it? When you're in the desiring mode, you're never there. You're never there. You're never there. You're never there until maybe you get caught up in its orbit. You spin and spin around it, and then you're looking at yourself and thinking, "What the fuck am I doing?" So, for example, an addiction, that's drive. Like yeah, there's something excremental about that, or like even masturbation. It's like whenever you're like done masturbating, you're never proud of yourself. You're never like, oh, that was a nice one. It's like, oh fuck, I'm a shit person. I'm also doing nofap, by the way. So this is why I've been doing nofap since the 1st of January, and it's been going super well. It's changed me a lot as a person. I really believe that every man should do it. It's kind of humiliating to hallucinate this image of a woman who is not there, and then put it on your own body until you're ashamed of yourself, right? And okay, so I'll add this to this too. I have a philosophical insight on nofap and masturbation. So this type of so the temporality of it, right? It's like you get caught up in the fantasy, you hallucinate whatever the dirty little thing is, and then maybe you come and then you're like, oh fuck, what did I do? But I think the sense of shame that you feel after it, or like just not being proud and drowsy and whatever and tired, I think that really is just that's simply the obverse of the fascination that you have when you're in the thing. Like it's the same thing actually. It's not a different thing. It's not that you do it and then you feel ashamed, but it's that once you're doing it and you're in the thing, you're just heavily repressing that shame that you already feel for it. And that's why I think, Zizek, for example, says that perversion is the highest state of repression. So, like a pervert will talk about, being sexually promiscuous, use all these sexual words, but actually, that's the way he represses it, right? That's the way he represses. Because if you open up a conversation about, his or her love life, and maybe the last time he broke his heart, oh, that's hysterization. That's like the worst possible thing for a pervert. So, yeah, I think perversion is I mean, it's a kind of refusal to trust yourself and lose yourself in the hysterization, and in the truth that always already speaks. Because philosophy is not really about true propositions anymore. It's about the truth that always already speaks. and the subjectivity in it, the perspective shifting. So yeah, these are some insights. So yeah, it's definitely you gotta. And on one hand, I feel like uni is a big obstacle that also, like today we had a class and I just wanted to kill myself because it was so bad. But on the other hand, it's like this is the truth. Like there's more truth in this obstacle than whatever I pretend to be, uh, whatever I pretend that there would be without this obstacle, right? Like this fantasy of what there would be without the obstacle just comes from the obstacle, which is already here. So that's what I have to face myself with. Like, okay, I have to work with this. I am here, not trying to like get out of it and pretend that you're not there. I think that's, yeah. And so I think the most prevalent label we could give to trying not to be where you are is cynicism. So the cynic will say, oh, I have all these personal beliefs and but I still on the outside act out whatever is expected of me. But I know that I'm right because, in my inner beliefs, I don't actually believe it. That's like the biggest trap, right? Because then you're like, you don't even face that you're responsible for your own actions as a subject, right? So you're denying your own freedom in there. And that's why being hystericized and speaking the truth of your anxious hysteria is so important and central to philosophy, because these are the experience we really can ground ourselves in. But yeah, it's not like, yeah, it's not a simple ground. I'll just stop it here. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing that all, Dimitri. And thank everyone. Wonderful to see you. I'll throw it to Daniel, Javier, and Michael there. And I like what you were saying on time and fixation. And I have that experience of well of reading old things and going, oh no, oh no. That sort of feeling I agree with. I also think that there, like, you were saying that there's something actually about being in that situation that's horrible that actually gets at something that's very important to undergo and experience. So I appreciate that. But let me throw it on to Daniel here. Daniel.
Thank you. I'm in the dark, coming from the dark. Um, Also, just say like really got a headache today, so I appreciate you still making the time and the space for us. Maybe we can try and accommodate. It's because like when we had that conversation last year, Daniel, I like decided that day that I was giving up coffee. And by the end of our conversation, the headache was just coming in. And I had like 3 days intense withdrawals, like night sweats, fever dreams. It was horrendous. And I tried not to like soften any of the symptoms because I wanted to kind of get the information of the habit that I'd been involved in, not in like a punitive way, but I was quite intrigued, like what is the accumulation here? It's like more in like a learning attitude. But I'm very much back on the coffee train, talk about like fixations and addictions and also like a cavity broke through in a tooth like a month ago. Oh, the headaches that come, it's insane. But it's like really, it has been, I think, Daniel, I heard you in a conversation recently speak about, was it like Tillich who had a pain in his neck and he had a growth, and then he didn't do anything about it, and I can really relate to this kind of um, finding your own way with symptom and pain, um, and that I'm really benefited from doing that. Um, I mean, the way that I was thinking about it is like, for whatever reason, that all this mouth habit in terms of consumption and eating produced the hole that then became the cavity. There's like something like a numbness in that habit, and the missing of information that now when it breaks through, I'm now receiving all of this information from that habit. So if I just try and numb it and get rid of the pain, um, it feels like I'm just kicking the can down the road for the information that I could be getting. But I also try and not speak too much about how I personally relate to sensations in the body and stuff, because that can just start like spiraling, I think. You don't want to implicate yourself too much in anything. But I appreciated the way that Dimitri spoke very freely, and also about addiction and all this good stuff. And it does kind of resonate just with these themes of, I guess, headache, and then also, I mean, I'm coming from the dark continent here, Africa, and the southern tip, Nogal. But the theme is darkness or void or negativity or death. Like I had quite a harrowing conversation recently, and I've been thinking a lot about perversion. But the conversation kind of steered towards violence, and fixation and ideation towards violence. And yeah, it's like quite a common thing. If someone's a gangster, like they like telling you that they're a gangster so that they can scare you. There's like an enjoyment. There's an enjoyment in presencing material in speech because of the way that it positions the person who is presenting the material. And so it's like a trope kind of gangster thing to speak about, oh, I was like in prison, or I'm a gangster, or something like this, because it conveys something, and largely to like scare the other person. But this kind of violence theme, because then I was also thinking about perversion, and the one image in terms of the screen, like repression's worst in perversion, because perversion uses an image or like the surface of the thing that it's repressing in order to achieve the repression. So this like minimal contact actually helps keep the thing sealed or concealed. So like access to sex as porn, like screen mediated pornography, it's like a lot of contact, but like surface level contact that actually means that whatever sex is repressed in that individual's relationship to it. So then like the access to porn is perverted. So like I mean that's just an example. It won't be exhaustive of perversion. But in this conversation then with this person who had been ideating violently, that going in that direction is not the right direction to go in at all, because then the implication is, oh, you just have to come into contact with the real violence, like don't hold yourself back, you need to explore that. And that's definitely not what I wanted to be sharing. That's not the way the conversation needed to go at all. So I guess I started speaking and I realized I was like putting my foot in it, so I backtracked a bit. But so the last thing I'll say, and it's also just like reiterating and saying the same thing that I said at the beginning, in terms of just a basic thanks, Daniel, for keeping this space going weekly, and even now, like in the context of your headache. And because I mean the value of it's really I think it's easy to underestimate the value of speech, and in this realm of like fixation, and like you have a conversation with someone around this dynamic that's been latent for like 2 years, and just the fact of the conversation, because they can come to articulate the thing, it like releases that material. It's no longer such a fixation because it's latent and it's not articulated. Like the power in speech and speaking to one another is really it's really crazy. Like it's it's also kind of tragic, because it can seem so simple a means of intervention, but yeah. So coming from the void, it's good to see you.
Well, thank you for all your kind words, Daniel, and it's a pleasure to be here. magic old maid's elixir. So, all is well. But thank you for everything you said there. And it's very interesting too, as you're talking about that, and I'll give it to Javier and Michael here. It's very interesting as well, Mr. Luber. Thank you for coming. It's very interesting to think of that issue of having a guard or something that keeps you from, that sustains the enjoyment because it keeps you from, but then having nothing to hold back, which leads to trouble. And I think like the releasing of the anger or just pure release, as Philip Reeve talks about, and how that becomes very, very problematic. But that reminds me of a comment that Michael made last week that was just kind of getting at something very important about how in these sex cults, they're saying philosophically true things, but in a way that is incorrect. So how do you tell the difference between the philosophical insight that can change your life in a powerful way versus when it's employed in a different context and it's actually very problematic? So, so for example, have courage. Well, you could use that logic to say, submit yourself to being taken advantage of because it takes courage, right? That was a point that Michael was getting at, right? But then there's also another idea that I think, as Mr. Ebert has said, and Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir, is that there's something about courage and the meaning of life that are connected together. So how does that go? How do you discern the difference, right? And I think what you're pointing at there is all of these various mechanisms of having to discern, when you release, when you hold back, what exactly is training for versus distraction from, and that there are all these kind of dynamics that have to be kind of discerned and figured out, in that and getting it wrong can be very consequential. I guess another thing that just came up as I was thinking about Michael's comment is I'm almost increasingly linking, not that I know that this is correct, I'm increasingly linking something about maturity or getting older as increasingly making being in situations where when you're young, you can only cause a disaster. And this is a generality. I'm not saying this is the case, but something about youth being tied to the only way to have like a really big negative consequence is to do something really big and bad. Now, I'm not talking accidents. Whereas as you get older and you get into more complicated or perhaps situations where you have authority, small mistakes can make massive consequences. And like how there's kind of a moving scale that like maturity is where you move into places where small mistakes or just getting things slightly off have massive consequences. And that's almost what I almost want to say there's something about maturity, I don't know, character that's actually tied to moving increasingly into spaces where the inability to tell small differences makes a huge difference. And there's almost a grace as you're growing up, perhaps, where that's not what you face. So you could avoid that and just say, screw it, I'm just going to kind of avoid those situations by somehow creating barriers that keep it from me and enjoying those barriers, which I think relationships are great context for that, right? Like in marriages, small little mistakes or small mishearings of things or not learning small skills in conversation could lead to really, really deep hurt, right? Well, then I'll just learn to enjoy the barrier that keeps me from the person, right? And one must not do that. Now, it depends on what we mean, but I'm going to pause and throw it to Mr. Rivera on this fine day. Mr. Rivera, please.
Thank you. So I think it's inevitable at this point, if we're talking about fixations, that we talk about beauty. Because what was the original fixation that formed us? And I thank Thomas Jockin for pointing this out to me here. Because if you read Lacan in the Mirror Stage, he actually gives this hint about beauty being the thing that formed our ego, and it's kind of producing a kind of erogenous effect in us. Okay. Now, the dismissal of beauty is that it's sort of, and this is obviously the big Kantian mistake that psychoanalysis has carried with it, which is the sublime beauty kind of split. Zizek, Zupančič, they both accept this kind of disastrous distinction. Basically what we've done is we've stripped away the horror that beauty sort of has within itself. But it's not that beauty is inherently horrifying, but that beauty itself had to support a kind of fictitious beginning for us, right? In order to begin in the world, we had to become fixated. That was our ego. Our ego was the original fixation. If we did not have this fixation, we would not have been able to deal with our alienation and then go into the world. We had to have this false portrayal as a sense of autonomy to begin. We could not begin the world assuming that we were helpless. So this is to say that when Lacan describes the mirror stage, and these are his words, I actually like the way this is described here, as a drama that had to unfold and fixate into becoming an ego. Now, the other thing that isn't attached to beauty when we speak of it this way is that if beauty is what formed us, and this is the assumption that kind of gets ignored, is that if beauty is what formed us, beauty was also the very thing that could undermine our formation. This is what is significant about looking back at Lacan's mirror essay. If beauty is what gave us the wholeness to start this fictitious beginning, it is also within itself to undermine its fictitious beginning, which is what Lacanians will now call the real. So, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about fixations, what are we fixated from? And what are we trying when we're saying that we're trying to undo a fixation? What are we doing it for? And so, and this is where I believe, like, when you thinking about what Coughan said about, the gangster trope, Well, the gangster has to tell a story. The story is the fixation. I'm a gangster. In order to transverse that fantasy, he has to see the frame in which he himself is formed. Right? So I think this is the element of what Lacan would call transversing the fantasy, right? You have to see the frame in which you yourself are formed, which is, in other words, beauty. I think I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
Well, I think it is very interesting to ask what exactly is fixed and how, and I'll give it to Michael, Mr. Luber here, and how there is something that is almost a necessary fixation that is going to lead to a certain bringing along so that the social can form, the subject can form, and yet there's almost a trick in that, and yet there's kind of a necessary trick, right? Like the fear of error is the fear of truth to some degree, right? And I think also you're pointing at a lot of the great mysteries on beauty can destroy you. All right. So beauty is not, so when we talk about beauty, it would be a mistake to say, quote unquote, necessarily good, right? We're dealing with dangerous things. And I think that alludes to a lot of what Michael is pointing at, is that when you're talking about, to use a term that has to be expanded upon, deepest fundamental reality, is you're dealing with something that has to be handled properly or approached properly. Because otherwise it will reduce, the term I like is Lovecraft, with the craft in parentheses. If you approach it incorrectly, it reduces you to ash. If you don't, if you approach it correctly, then it becomes all, and it does what beauty does, and it compels you and virtue and so on and so forth. You get a positive feedback loop, right? I think basically you could almost say that the structure of history into this moment has been perhaps somewhat similar to what you're describing as a fixation of the subject, but looking at the history as a whole, where it's had fixations that has brought it to this point where now it has to deal with beauty as the primary thing versus truth or goodness. And we've talked about all those many times, but you see, the issue is, for very good reason, we've put off beauty, because if you do it wrong, you get reduced to ash. It destroys you, right? And so there's really, really high stakes, right? Because the weird thing about beauty is the very experience of it is overwhelming, in that very overwhelm. Well, I've been thinking a lot, not to go too much down this, I've been thinking a lot of, and I haven't written anything out, but I was speaking with Seth and Aspasia, and and I'm no expert on Bataille. I'm not very, I haven't written on him, but I kind of think about the excess and the libidinal. And really, I've been thinking about the problem of overwhelm, like overwhelm. Overwhelm is really interesting because there's a way in which we long to be overwhelmed. We long to be lost in something, right? But then there's another way where overwhelm means we're destroyed because we're overwhelmed. There's the overwhelm, which means there's so much going on, we're overwhelmed and we can't function. So like you can't function. But then there's the overwhelm where you're overwhelmed by joy, right? And there's another way where if you've had a mystical experience where you've been overwhelmed by, say, God or something, then it becomes easier not to be overwhelmed by Facebook, notifications was the example where maybe you feel obligated to get back to everything because you realize that in the end it's not that important or something, right? And how there are these various functions of overwhelm and how to approach overwhelm in the right way. And overwhelm is also really interesting because it simultaneously suggests a certain lack, a certain inability, a certain unable to grasp, but also in that very overwhelm and inability, there's a certain joy in it, right? There's a certain sort of then sending you out as a more definitive being. Like if you're overwhelmed in the right way, then it makes you more yourself, more definitive, right? And so there's something very interesting in that kind of language. And there's something when we talk about the Lovecraft, you can be overwhelmed by love, or you could be overwhelmed by Lovecraft, right? And what determines the difference between those things? Where we talk about virtue, we talk about artfulness. And I think that's starting to get at why these similar notions like courage can be used in service of, say, a sex cult, like we talked about last week. And we'll never get old to mention the fact that we talked about sex cults last week because that was grand. How there's a problem where that same idea that has a lot of truth in philosophical discussions like we talked to can actually be used to lead you to being taken advantage of. Part of that seems to be the relation of the command in light of overwhelming and what overwhelming, or how to handle a certain overwhelming, or artfulness of overwhelming. And maybe, I obviously by overwhelm here, I'm thinking all in beauty, and I'm not even saying it's the best term, but I kind of like it in some respects because it has this double good and, this double like longing and this double negative. And it's funny, I guess what I'm also saying that fixation can either seemingly be a way to deal with overwhelm because you get fixated and keep yourself from being overwhelmed, or there's a fixatedness on being overwhelmed, right? That there's a kind of longing for both of those different things. So it's interesting to think of subjectivity in relation to overwhelm and choice of overwhelm and how to be overwhelmed. And perhaps a globally connected world with global pluralism is one where the problem of overwhelm is now something the average person has to experience, that they find themselves regularly encountering, where in perhaps less interconnected, complex world, that wasn't so much the case. I've just been thinking about that recently, and it came to mind as you were speaking. And I like what you were saying on drama, but I will pause and throw it to Michael and then Mr. Luber. Michael, please.
Well, last week, Aspasia, or 2 weeks ago, asked for a torchbearer for Freud and Jung in the Lacan discussion. So seeing as she's not here, I'll try at least the Jungian framing of addiction. So I think from what I've read, kind of the kind of key departure from Freud in kind of the context of looking at addiction is Jung talks about a spiritual drive. So in his kind of instinct theory of psychology, it's not just, you have like the impetus or the libido and then the aim and the object. Like for Freud, like kind of all of our instincts are object seeking. For Jung, it's more complex than that. There's like another kind of layer there of a kind of a grasping for some sort of spiritual wholeness. And so, he talks about how the craving for alcohol is like a low level striving for some spiritual wholeness. And so, like he was instrumental in kind of in an indirect way for the formation of the 12-step program. I think I may have mentioned that in weeks past. And specifically the first step, like we admit we're powerless over alcohol, and then the second step, like we acknowledge that a power greater than us can restore our sanity. Like that was directly inspired by work he was doing with this client who, he had like multiple stints with Jung, and when he came back the second time, Jung was basically like psychoanalysis can do nothing more for you. Like you need to have some sort of religious conversion to kind of free yourself from the addiction. And yeah, that's just like a really helpful and like powerful framing for me. And it's funny, Daniel, you mentioned the gangster. I think somewhere Jacob Kashir will be smiling because I just came out of his men's circle, and this month the archetype is the spiritual gangster. And like today we were asked to deliver a speech as if we were a gangster, like an unconscious, not spiritual, gangster to the other men in the group. And like, there was like lots of swearing and growling and like anger and like kind of degrading language and a degrading perspective towards each other. And it's scary as shit to like tap into that. And to like, and to embody that perspective. But there's like this profound kind of navel gazing, that is present. And it's interesting to kind of, because we were talking at one point in the session about how, navel gazing can kind of consume someone, overwhelm, in a way where you get kind of like consumed with your own kind of deficiencies, or kind of like in like a self-loathing, kind of self-flagellating way, when you're kind of always thinking about yourself. And like the invitation to turn towards service and to turn towards something that's outside of yourself, can help kind of transform that and sublate that. But then there's also this like shame that's kind of masquerading as this overfitted confidence that I think is like evident in the gangster of like, I'm gonna show you who I am. Like I'm gonna act like the tough guy. I'm gonna, kind of just be leading with my dick, and and how that is also like ultimately like there's like an uninitiated like heart and love and right and regard for the other that is also absent there. And so I really like what Dimitri was saying about perversion, and the shame that you feel after doing something perverse is not like something downstream from, or like a symptom of the perverse act, but it's like it's what actually was already there, like it was already present, and it was just the act was your way of suppressing it. And so in some way, like doing something perverse and then actually being confronted with that shame is actually like, if you actually face that and really understand it and like integrate it, that can actually be a way out of doing that thing. So like there actually is like, and I think that's kind of what Jung is getting at with the proclivity to be addicted, is like there is some wisdom that is trying to shine forth, right? Like there, whether it be some wound or pain or something that is too painful to bear, that is the reason that you're using the thing, that like that ultimately, if that's understood, can be brought up towards God. And that was, Jacob brought a guest, one of his friends, Jordan Bates, who's an incredible men's circle facilitator, and he's like kind of very, very devout in his faith. And kind of to him like kind of collecting all of these different energies, the kind of darker masculine ones, the divine feminine ones, and like bringing it towards God ultimately, is how to integrate it. And so I think that's, to the kind of how do you discern between what's cultish and what's like wisdom. I think if there is a clear orienting principle that is beyond any of the members that exist in the thing, I think with like, not to harp on the sex cult thing, but I think that example, it's like the experience of orgasmic meditation, like that was like the end all be all. Like there wasn't anything higher than that was like bringing those people together. Like it was the experience in and of itself. Like it's like the somatic experience, and then what? For what? Dwelling in what? And that seems to me, I mean, I'm sure there's obviously plenty examples of like cults that appear to be very spiritual and very aligned with God that, inevitably are actually also like deeply problematic. But those were kind of just some thoughts.
Well, I appreciate Mr. Kashir doing that work, and I hope he's doing well. And I think, what's very interesting is there are some realities of what it means to be human that need to be handled, but handling them or working with them is very dangerous. And if it's done incorrectly, then it leads to unintentional consequences, right? So one of the issues that can kind of be asked is relative to what is that work being done, right? Like you're saying, if it's toward God, or if it's toward beauty, or if it's toward X, Y, and Z, right? What exactly is that work being done for? And ultimately, even if you're doing it toward beauty, you're doing it toward something dangerous, which is also very interesting. So, in many respects, history perhaps has not done it toward the Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses, because if it's done incorrectly, it reduces us to ash, right? But then it's also just very interesting because there's something I think about human beings that basically longs. We long to do something that has that kind of risk. We long to do something that requires that of us, right? And we long for a conception. I mean, to Jochen's work, we long for a conception of virtue that is tied to that kind of courage, to be dealing with things that have that level of danger to them, if not done correctly. But the fact that you're dealing with this level of danger, I think, also suggests why, if misdone, can lead to these different problems that is going forth. And perhaps that sense, I mean, I've been languaging it just in this way of an overwhelm, but as I understand Jung, this notion of this spiritual sense, I think, is tied to a desire. We desire to be overwhelmed, right? Now, of course, this language could be tied to oceanic feeling, all of that sort of language, right? But what's very interesting about the overwhelm, I guess I kind of like, is the sense of we long for something fundamentally dangerous, right? And because we long to be overwhelmed, if we buy this, we long some sort of experience, then we're vulnerable, precisely to get into situations where we are feeling overwhelmed or overtaken, and we thus associate that with the right thing, right? So that kind of spiritual drive can lead us into problematic ways. So then when you talk about something like alchemizing the masculine and the female, there's something about that to me that is some sort of figuring out the way to handle that drive for overwhelm in a manner that actually leads into the overwhelm, where we are participating in something, where you're actually in the beautiful in a manner that doesn't lose differentiation, and yet it becomes more definitive. It becomes more so itself in its definitiveness. And yet that does not lead to a feeling of, separation that becomes something that we then rail against, right? And yet, nevertheless, that definition is there. So there's I think there is constantly in many of these, and then I'll throw it to Luber and Mr. Jochen here. I think in many of these practices, there is some sort of search for a particular way by which to alchemize forces or bring things together that, left to their own devices, tends to mishandle the overwhelm or mishandle drive and desire, mishandle fixation or something like that. And there's increasingly a notion of, well, how to put those things together to do those things. Well, that's part of the new thought. And perhaps there's something about fixation and then shame. And it's interesting also to compare shame cultures and guilt cultures. There are different, Easts are more supposedly shame cultures, where it's social based, guilt is more of the West, individual based. Not that we have to hold that language. And is there something tied to that, which is a feeling of failing to take on the challenge of overwhelm, ignoring the challenge of overwhelm, things like that? I'm not sure. And again, I've just been thinking about that. But I also like what Mr. Luber was saying with overwhelm and overdetermination. That's very interesting. I mean, thinking of overdetermination and thinking of that in, sometimes in Marxist language, there's a way in which we overdetermine precisely to protect us from the overwhelm. We end up kind of overdetermining our experience of reality in a certain way precisely so that we're not overwhelmed. But then increasingly, what I guess I've been thinking about is we have to figure out how to use overwhelm against overwhelm. Because if we overdetermine ourselves against overwhelm, then we end up being overwhelmed by Facebook notifications or a job where we never get work-life balance. You can't escape this problem. But then how do you handle it? And then again, what's interesting is the overwhelming experience of the geopathic, as Mr. Rivera and Jochen and Michelle have talked about, can actually be used to help you not be overwhelmed by sort of the pressures of the rest of life. It becomes easier to let those things go so that they don't become cancerous in one's experience, to allude to Eber. But I will pause and I will throw it to Mr. Luber and then Mr. Jochen. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you. And I really do like that haircut, sir. You are looking sharp.
Thank you. Thank you. I kind of wanted to talk about, with what I'm hearing, kind of like how to spot the differences in conversation, in social interaction. And I think maybe starting from the concept of difference versus the concept of opposites might be a fruitful thing to talk about. But also, I just wanted to point out, while it's just fresh on my mind, there seems to me to be a direct relation between the overdetermined, the existential feeling of overwhelmed, and Wolfgang Smith's internal realm, where things happen instantaneous, where he's basically suggesting that this internal realm, in his book Vertical Causation, essentially is outside of time. And therefore, like, again, I'm not an expert on Hegel, so, I'll leave it to the Hegelians on the Zoom here to say fuck you, Andrew. But basically, in that sense, it's outside dialectics. This instantaneousness, or what Desmond would say, overdeterminacy. I would just want to say, like, from an existential point of view, I mean, when you're feeling overwhelmed, I would say the future is kind of crashing in front of you. Like, the possibility, like, it's not that you're in a possibility space when you're in that existential position. It seems like you are prior to that field. And it seems like, in a certain sense, you have to let the reality around you unfold a little bit before you get a proper sense of the possibility space. So, in a certain sense, when you're overwhelmed, you kind of have to let whatever's happening happen a little bit. And then when the reality around you kind of settles, where it's like it's kind of out of your control, and you start to get that creeping feeling of, okay, like I now can understand the possibilities. I now can see possible actions that I can do. And that in a certain sense, that realization can be overwhelming, but I wouldn't say that's overwhelming proper. Overwhelming proper is like probably before you even know what to do. So I guess with that point, there seems to be this aspect of the human being that doesn't know what to do, and then life kind of happens a little bit, and then they know what to do. And like, oh, it's like, oh fuck, I have to do all this. And it's like that thought could be daunting, but at least there's like a there's an order of operations. You know, okay, first I would have to do this, then that, then the third. And that might feel overwhelming, but again, that's not overwhelming proper. It would be, just to reiterate, like overwhelming proper to me would be like we don't know what to do. You're kind of like outside of time in a certain sense. Then things happen, you get a sense of time, and then you are like, okay, I now know what to do. And that I know what to do can still be overwhelming, but I wouldn't say again it's overwhelming proper. So like the way I was just connecting it with at least the instantaneous nature is like everything settles like that. It's like you're watching, all these things are happening at once and you don't know how to process it, and then something happens where you're able to then process it. Now I'm saying it in a very like crude fashion, but it's kind of like an analogy is like when you're working on a story, um, like when you're working out a story, it's like there's all these you could be feeling overwhelmed because you don't even have a sense of the order, and then you're sitting in that feeling, and then it strikes you where it's like, okay, I now have a sense of the order. And then for the story, the time started to emerge. Like you understand the order of events and how time ought to be felt in those order of events. Um, so that is just something that I'm like thinking out loud based off what you're saying. And there seems to be this like connection to Wolfgang Smith and then Desmond's. And then, I mean, I would say with Desmond's, and this kind of leads into the difference versus opposite from a concept level. Opposites are easier to identify than difference. And like in a story, when one character becomes X and then the opposite Y by the end, it's like it's a story, it's a good story, but I think it's like less likely for something to kind of strike you and kind of have a self-revelation of like, wow, okay, like that story really like got me. Like I think when stories really get you, it's a reveal of difference where basically like you're able to spot a nuance, and the way you were able to spot a nuance is obviously like you resonate with something. So like I guess like how I'm thinking about it in like a social situation, it's like um you you're not able to articulate the difference. So like you with an opposite, you would be able to articulate it. But I think with the difference, it's like you actually encounter it first, and then you get you get like a certain feeling where it's like there's a tension here, or there's a connection here, and you're gonna just need to like keep at that connection or tension in order to be able to articulate the difference. So I think um, it's like I'm going to be very crude. You meet someone, I'm short, they're tall. You know, I would call that I would call that more on the opposites side of things, where you can like literally point out very easily right away without like having a whole experience unfold with that other person, the opposite. Where like the difference is actually something that you would say after the experience, where it's like you really have to tarry with this experience, and in that particular experience, you'll be able to articulate the difference. And I think you know, each difference that you're articulating is particular to that experience, where opposites are tropes. Opposites are, you can kind of point out these juxtaposing things and kind of map it onto other abstract experiences. Or you could postulate about other experiences and map on these opposites. Where with differences, you can't sit in an armchair and be like, okay, I just experienced this difference. Now I'm going to map it onto this hypothetical experience. I don't think you can do that, because I think the experience that the difference is mapping onto is a one for one, and you can't actually imitate it. Um, so yeah, just I guess a couple very loose thoughts I wanted to throw out. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
I think that's very good. What's very interesting is that I think difference is actually only found in relationship, and I'll just make the critical example of marriage, which, funny enough, you tend to enter into because you're similar or you think you're similar. And actually, difference has to be earned through similarity. Like it is, difference is what is when is difference can be what emerges when similarities participate in one another. And the possibility of participation is given by the similarity, which actually unveils a difference. And that's why there's a certain sort of, if you're not ready for it, there's a surprise that can overwhelm you and destroy you, right? Because you're like, I didn't know we were different this way. And actually, you could argue the challenge of virtue and beauty is for you to be glad in the difference. Like for you to experience difference and be like, I'm glad you're different, actually. Like, which is incredibly hard, because how do you find gladness in difference, right? Because it demands something of you, right? It makes you question yourself in your definitiveness, right? So I think sometimes opposites can be a way to thinking in terms of opposites can be a way to shield ourselves from the challenge of difference. And actually not realizing that difference is something that can only, you can't really think difference, you encounter difference, right? Like you participate in difference, it emerges. Well, that means it's commitment, relationship, time, where you're in it so that it can emerge, right? And then the question is, what do you do when it emerges? Does it break, or can you hold? And that gets into virtue, right? And if you can hold it, then it may actually be able to afford beauty that otherwise would not be known, right? So there's something about a commitment to beauty that is tied to a commitment to encountering difference, which we can shield ourselves from doing because we talk in terms of opposites. I mean, an opposite also means you can make it intelligible to you because you understand that's opposite. Therefore, I know what it is, right? So there's more of an ability to have an intellectual hold on it. You actually have more control over opposites than difference, right? So difference is something more outside your control. Therefore, it is potentially more overwhelming. But, and again, the language of overwhelm might be doing too much here. I just keep thinking about that term because when difference, it can overwhelm you, but then there can also be a certain way where it suspends your categories and gives you a quality of experience that's almost like inwhelming, freedom in, like, you know, it's this in a certain fullness. That's actually really, really important, right? So when does difference become overwhelming or inwhelming, I suppose, or upwhelming? Like it can have a sublative structure to it, right? And what's very interesting about that is too, like, I guess I've been thinking about when I make a distinction between thinking and perceiving, and then I'll give it to Jockin and Daniel here and anyone else who wants to speak on this fine day, is that when I think about the bookshelf, I'm not, I'm thinking about it's fixed, but if I stop thinking and just pure perceive it, there's something overwhelming about pure perception, right? Like you're overwhelmed by the lack of just kind of this thing you can't put into words, this pure experience. But then there's another way where it's not overwhelming because you're not overwhelmed proper, anxious, and different things, right? There's something where you're now kind of in it, which in a sense is overwhelming your difference, kind of overwhelming the distinction. So there's something that's kind of overwhelmed. But in another sense, it actually kind of is like, oh, this is rest. This is Sabbath. This is actually good, right? And that actual kind of experience of perception perhaps, and then beauty would be, you know, that's right, would be, beauty would be some sort of radical intensification of that experience into all, that actually creates a certain level of liberation from overwhelm proper. And perhaps sometimes fixation, like fixing on the bookcase, can occur because I think thinking is naturally fixating. Like thinking naturally tends toward fixation, for good and for bad. That very fixation can create a feeling of intelligibility and defense from the pure perception, which can be scary, and I don't know what to think of it. But that could also just be like the screen, that's keeping you from the real, the pornography, that comes to be enjoyment. So one can enjoy the thought, but there's actually perhaps a perversion there in some sense. So I've been thinking about that, and then I guess also that ability to actually encounter difference would require you not to be fixed in a relationship, to actually let the person come forth in surprise, and not to be married to your fixed ideas in such a way, that when the difference appears, you thus abandon it or give up or go away from it. But Mr. Luber, please.
Let me just add with like the fixation point. It's like what you should be, how you are fixated in something should allow you within that very fixation to undermine that fixation, which produces the continuation of fixation as such, which you're enjoying. You're like actually enjoying that process. So the question is, how do you prepare the subject to do that? That to me means, and again, I'm going to just say another little hot take because I know the Hegelians, but it's like there has to be something outside of dialectics, right? Because dialectics would be the fixation as such and the process of undermining it and enjoying it. But that would be the dialectical process, right? Like not dialectics. Not dialectics. Okay, I'll stop talking. But if you see my point, it's like there's something, there's this feedback loop regarding fixation. But then there's the question of how does the subject actually go about doing that? And it seems like it would be something outside of that feedback loop. And when I say outside, I don't mean that it's like completely detached from the feedback loop, but it's like almost parasitical in the feedback loop. Like it, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Well, for me, like what you're saying, so if I just use Michelle's example, you're fixed on Michelle, but then as Michelle becomes more definitive and thus different, then that undermines your fixedness. But then when the definitive is beautiful, it reconstitutes your fixedness because you're attracted to it, of which then leads you more into the definitiveness that undermines your fixation, but that fixation continues to occur, right? And there is a sense in which one is not, yeah, I mean, speculative reason beyond dialect. I mean, one is not dialectical with Michelle, right? In the sense of, your dialect, but in Michelle becoming more definitiveness, there's a passing over into more of this one of oneness that undermines your fixedness, that then actually pulls you in more and more. So that making of them more definitive, I think, has this underlying structure, but that means you're able to handle difference. That means you're able to handle the surprise in the encounter, which then the question is, how do you do that? How do you develop the virtue to do that? And what exactly is continuing to pull you in? Well, beauty. There's something about beauty that is precisely attracting you in, but beauty is dangerous. So the very thing that actually kind of affords the possibility of this fixed, unfixed, fixed, unfixed, fixed, unfixed is a dangerous thing. And so for most of history, we've said, well, let's just not use the dangerous thing. But the problem is then it's overly fixed, overdetermined, or you don't have anything you get fixed on, and you can become psychotic. You become unable. You become fixed in your own weak speech or something. So what would it mean? And I know Mr. Rivera put Sith Zone in the chat. So when you are actually finding this right ability to fixed, unfixed, fixed, unfixed, fixed, unfixed, you do it by making something definitive, one of one, which that means the more you know, the more you find there's more to know, the more you know there's to know, when actually I can know what a woman is, but I can't know what Michelle is. And yet, this is the weird mood, that very unknown of Michelle with the UN in parentheses is precisely the mechanism of deepening into the fullness of her, right? And so that undermines the fixedness, but doesn't abandon the thing that I am pulled toward, right? So, but that means you're kind of fixed on the unknown, like you're fixed on the unfolding, which you have to be able to handle. But I will pause and then throw it to Mr. Jockin, then Daniel, then Mr. Ebert, Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to read Javier's recent essay. I think his reading of Lacan, again, I'm biased because I pointed it to him. I was like, yo, you check out this thing Lacan wrote about beauty? Holy snakes. I'm using it myself for an essay I'm working on now. I haven't gone to it. I haven't gone out yet. So I want to start with the first. I think this idea of overwhelm. I think the really interesting part about this is Daniel. You've talked before about this, Daniel. Crying. One cries in joy. One cries in despair. The same activity. It's almost like the body can't help itself in the encounter of excess, in whatever direction that goes. It requires the cathartic release, right? And tears are those kind of tears of joy, tears of sorrow, tear of repentance, take your pick. I think that's quite interesting. It's almost like crying is one of those signs of the encounter of the excess of being. It's your body telling you you're at that contact point. Now, the interpretation of that crying is actually the critical moment. Because actually it relates to the idea of, Roberto Eco had an essay recently about, well, not recently, but I read it recently. One of my students related to, it had made a very important part, is that the question is, when is one able to say a burial is beautiful? Which is, by the way, in Plato. Plato has that in Greater Hippias. It's that same line. What is a beautiful burial? And the qualification is explicitly, and Roberto Eco says this, when it's a beloved, your beloved's dead. How would you possibly see that event as beautiful? Now, I just had my father pass away, so I could feel the vibrations cutting through me, and even in the experience of even asking that question. But that's the whole point, is that, see, the reason why beauty was never dealt with this way is because that to really take it seriously to the full extent is you have to get to that point. Most people don't want to experience that. You do not want to experience it. I think the keynote is that generally when we enter the encounter of the loss of the beloved, that is in the operation of the good, it's too devastating. We want to forget. We want to obfuscate, forget. And I think a lot of the nature of anxiety is anticipation. That's actually another aspect of it. So I think that the issue with ambiguity, excess, and lack, and I think this is the keynote, is trust me, the encounter of the death of someone you love is very much, and that relationship of sorrow that comes from that is absolutely I think one of those contact points of lack, one of those absolute areas about it, especially how you're going to see it and how you treat it. Yeah, it's coming either way. And I think a big note is actually that, and that's the thing too, is like, even it's interesting sometimes in absence of commitment fixation, because there are certain people who grieve, who never let go. And in fact, that's actually the great danger of when you lose someone beloved, a very close person that you love very much, is the danger is what happens if you fixate. You try to grab on to the loss. You grab on that loss and you never let go. There's some individuals I know who had that. They lost parents. They lost really very significant relationships, and they never let go. And it's basically the world continued on, reality continued on, but they're captured in the phantasms. This is actually why Lacan's section, again, I almost feel tempted to read out the whole paragraph from Javier's Substack about it, because it captures this quality of the power of the beauty. The reason the beautiful is considered so dangerous and so suspicious, that's on two grounds. One was this idea, because by the excess of being, we want to forget being. So there's that aspect about it. That's why we want the safety of the good. The other aspect is because of the power of the images. So the whole point of the mirror phase from Lacan, from my understanding of that reading, which caught my attention, was when this individual child sees, it does not have language yet. That's the key. This is the key, is that there's no language yet. Just the child encountering the image of a mirror, a reflection of that person, of themselves. It's the ecstatic image of something superior to them that gives them the generation of the I function. So the generation of the ego is made by the image, and thus the whole point of the misrepresentation of the self, right, made by the mirror image. This is always the anxiety of beauty because it operates by images. So how are the images connected to reality? How are they connected to essence? How are we not just being deceived into just illusions? This is always the anxiety of the beautiful because it answers the question of the nature of the images. And especially when beauty always has this demand of particularity and definiteness. How the heck can an abstractional image that's not the thing point to the reality of the thing and actually give you contact to it? That's always the great question of the beautiful when we talk about it this way. As well as actual Daniel, but what Daniel in the Dark said, I think a big notice. You know what's interesting, Daniel? As a comment, yeah, that's his name now. The Hearts, okay. Is that if you got sick and you couldn't come to the net and you canceled it, I'd legitimately be bummed out, legitimately. Like I'd be like, no, it really would be a real like, oh man, I'm looking forward to that. Like I was I wish you well, and I totally get it, totally understand. But the very fact, I just find it interesting that that even that thought of hypothetical of the commitment of like the habituational commitment of like what the net is, it's gotten to the point where it's been altercated into me, habituated into me. I'm like anticipatorily looking forward to it. I just find it interesting. But I want to say that because of the nature of what you say about relationships and difference, right? They're not otherness, they're a difference. So, and the idea of, again, with Michelle, with individuation, and I think the idea of like, recently also I've been having a whole lot of interest in agentic AI. It's like a whole nother world out there with this stuff. If before we had basically generative AI with the making of the images. So again, the idea of the illusions of the images, right? It's causing epistemic uncertainty. No one knows. You can't trust the images now to know reality anymore. We're already having that happen. Now in agentic AI, we have like multiple agents doing activities synchronous at synchronously at different times, all active doing activities, and then they synchronize and corrugation swarms in the language they're using about it. We basically have operations of basically golems, literally, like basically magical golems who are doing activities and generating things. It does answer the question eventually, especially if the question, I think Javier and me and Luber have talked about this in contemporary discourse. What is a friend? Really, at best, it is a friendship of utility or a pleasure. It's like our conceptions of friendship are only really those two. A friendship or virtue is incredibly rare and rarely ever discussed and taken as a serious discussion or orientation of what is our lives to be meant and how we should relate to each other. I say this because the idea of the AI agent coming in to replace it, AI therapists, AI girlfriends, right, sex bots, etc. And then even in work, where you have to do work together, but now you got the AI agents. You can just bypass people. Don't worry about that. They're at the level of basically a pretty good junior level employee at this point. And then when you stack it with like multiple levels of interventions of it, you can get pretty high outputs, apparently. Apparently, we're getting to the point where within coding and developer lands and engineering lands, there's starting to be organizations where none of them are touching code at all. They're just operating on agents. That's all they're doing. I'm saying this in the sense of asking the question once again: what is the nature of friendship, and what is it to be remaining to it? And I say that, so I bring this up because of the net. I've been chewing on this. I just find the sense of those agents are really no best than the Fantasia episode, The Apprentice. You know, like from the movie, like the Disney one, where Mickey gets the hat because the apprentice gets the magic power and just get his chores resolved by the broom doing it, and guess what happens? It just runaway chain reaction disaster. So it can only fulfill the commands and desires and wishes that the subject already knows and wants. But with a friendship or virtue, in the language of if a friendship or virtue is another self, in the language of Aristotle, and this is part of my essay I'm going to write about, and but not in a but it's not in the self-consciousness of competitiveness that Lacan talks about, or even a Hegelian point of view, to my understanding of Hegel, in terms of when he talks about this nature of the subconscious and the antagonistical competition of goods. What is the nature of the friendship, the virtue then? That is another self that does not have a co-competitive innate relationship to it. Indifference. How can you be the same? And how can you have the? It's how can you be the same and different? So I've been playing with this language and thinking about what's of the like it is chirality. So there's like left-handedness and right-handedness. What is the friend or virtue but a chiral self? Meaning, it mirrors give you. If mirrors give you a chiral image, and as a result, if this heart and if the soul with a heart is a mirror, and when you witness a friend in a relationship of virtue, you have another self. It's because there's a mirror. It's a chiral image of you. It's not you, yet it is you, because you're participating in virtue together, in the sense that that virtue is distinct and unique to the individual. There's only one virtue. It's the one you have. Every person's expression of courage, temperance, justice, wisdom will be different. And in fact, that's the point, is that actually you enjoy witnessing of the virtue of the other. So for example, the fact that Javier is basically taking my ideas and is running with it in his direction is absolutely delightful to see. I hop on these calls and people talking about these ideas of addiction and contact and commitment and overwhelm. Again, it's just like, I didn't come in participating this. I didn't come anticipating this, better said. Like, that's the key. It's like, I'm not anticipating this, but I'm in a posture state to be open to take in insight. And I get delighted by the surprises I get encountered with. And that's, I think that's that aspect of friendship, the virtue that AI models, I don't think can do. There's like that aspect of it, but it's also the idea of memory. Here's a fun side note. There's actually, I saw an article recently that apparently ChatGPT 4 got removed, 4.0 got removed from the public libraries. Guess what happened? A whole bunch of AI girlfriends just faded, gone. Because the memory's gone. The model's gone, so the memory's gone. So the AI agents don't exist anymore. Those AI girlfriends or therapists don't exist anymore. I find that very interesting, because what is one of the purpose, I've said this before, I think one of the purposes of a friend is that mirror to cryo and the cryo self as a mirror for you to the other, and by holding you in memory, remembering you, knowing you. And then again, in the ways of this I actually do really believe that the part of what saves human beings from absolute dependence is our relationship to memory. It's because of our relation, and as you said, Daniel, I think very well, the reward of virtue is memory. Is because you actually have this relationship to memory where you don't want to forget. You're not in traumatic capture. You're not in fixated states of being taken onto from the outside. You actually have a dispositional state. You can have the freedom to get a spark of grace, right? A basic imposition of grace to be open to a remembrance of something that's important. That there were no as you say, Daniel, just even an example, you see two billiard balls hit each other, right? And then you see by seeing that you remember your sister, right? And you want to call them. Again, that's where freedom comes in those kind of relationships. So I've been chewing on that, but again, I want to just close by saying, go read. Javier's on a roll lately. It's been great to see his work on these essays in Substack, and I highly encourage you all to check it out. That's all for me.
Good job, Javier. Oh, well put, Mr. Jock, and I'll give it to Daniel and then Alex here. And yeah, I mean, a few things. When you were speaking of, and thank you for your kind words on the net. When you're speaking of beauty, it's very interesting because it seems as if one of the ways the dangers, quote unquote, risks of beauty are checked is it leaves. Like, it's there and then it leaves, right? Because if it stayed, that fixedness could become pathological and problematic and manipulative. So it goes away, right? And then in order to get it back, one has to, say, develop virtue, which then means when you come upon it again, you have the right relation to it, right? And there's something to be said about the danger of a beauty that doesn't leave, right? Or something that doesn't go away, right? What seems to be, and of course that would require memory, right? You'd have to have the memory and then organize your actions accordingly. Clayton, thank you for coming, sir. So likewise, it seems to be the case that there's something about friendship that actually is precisely the leaving and coming back has a lot of the testament to what friendship is, right? But when you have relationships of utility, it's not clear if the coming back is a coming back or if it's just getting the service again, right? So this return, right? This kind of coming back. And then absolutely, so good to see you, Dimitri, thank you. So this coming back, which of course Hume and Hegel, the return, that then brings a new quality in the return, seems very, very important. I think also, as you were saying, it is interesting to think of if one asks, what is virtue? You know, we've talked about it. You know, last week we were mentioning the ethics that, you know, people are feeling imprisoned by, but then this virtue of the beautiful. There's something about virtue that is the ability to handle difference, which again, since difference has to be surprising, it's the commitment to the experience where difference can be unveiled, and the handling of difference, which then will go through a period of time where the difference is not there because it has to appear, which is tied to kind of the commitment and the memory. So you kind of have to go through the work believing in its possibility, but then difference is hard as well. So you're committed to something that's going to challenge you, and you're getting ready for that thing that can challenge you. And then your ability to get ready for something not there is going to require some level of memory, to have a sense of how to organize and orient yourself toward it. And then if that very difference actually is the quality of something that becomes more one of one, more different. Oh, you thought, like people do it in marriages all the time. I thought I knew you, and wow, it's as if I didn't even know you, right? For many, that's devastating. But for other people, that can actually be like, oh, actually, you learn if you can handle that devastation, and that demands something of you, and that changes you as a subject and changes the quality of the relationship and becomes something that you look forward to. And there is something, I suppose, I guess, when you're speaking about friendship, what I'm thinking about, and I have too many notes. I appreciate everything, what you were saying on crying and the bothness of the excess and the loss and that's very important as well. And this also is pointing to the endless debate between like Deleuze and Lacan, and to what degree when Deleuze, you know, describes children as connecting and they have all these connections and they're creative and there's excess, but then you have Lacan that's talking about lack. Like, what is the relationship between these two things? How do they go together? Is lack in the socialization? Is it in the subject? Is it precisely what the subject makes itself in light of? But to what degree is that actually through the socialization? There's that. Because there is that very fascinating relationship between lack and excess. But I guess there's something about friendship that seems to precisely be actually tied to the commitment to difference that you don't leave behind, that comes out because friends become different, not just opposite. Like they become different. And a friend is someone, I guess what I want to say is a friend is someone of whom the appearance of their difference did not end the relationship. Maybe that's what a friend is, that the appearance of difference didn't end the relationship. And you could say, and Christian, good to see you, sir. You could say a lot of marriages kind of quote unquote in that sense can lack friendship because they're not able to last after the appearance of the difference. Maybe they're legally still together, but they become offish and cold to one another to some degree, right? And then, like, there's something interesting about difference in this sense, because that's such a fascinating word. Because when a person who you're in a commitment with becomes more one of one, it's simultaneously an experience of, oh, they're more than what I thought they were. They're, you know, in that sense, excessive of it. And then in their difference, there's another sense where, oh, they're more not me. So there's a certain lack in it, and that there's a complicated experience that goes on where you experience the lack, but it's a present absence. So it's not leaving you behind. And it's also unveiling that there's more to it than you thought. And then it becomes a friendship if you handle that and stick with it. And then the experiences of awe and beauty seem to be tied to one's capacity to do that very thing. But that moment of the surprise, that moment of the emergence of the difference seems to be something very important to focus on, to think these conflicting points. But I will pause, throw it to Daniel and then Mr. Ebert. Daniel, please.
That moment of difference, a moment of the emergence of difference. I mean, it's kind of like, I think I've been thinking in this proximity, also close to what I was hearing Luber say in terms of well, difference. We're on the same word with contradiction, and then loss. I think what Thomas brought in with like practical, well, life loss of another. It's like the loss happens, so there's this loss, the dropping away of a reference, and that reference is even then a friend or a lover or beloved, and then that absent space, it has some like minimal presence, and at the moment of loss, it's like that present absence is most marked or profound, but in the wake of that, it's meant to be kind of picked up. It kind of gets swallowed, like it's almost meant to get swallowed. Like, so if there's a fixation, it has to find something to grab onto in order to retain that place of where the loss occurred. And then now the fixation becomes about the thing that was used to mark the place, but that isn't the loss. It now becomes too much of a concretized mark or residue. So it's like it's this game of the forgetting and the remembering. It's like there's this moment of the breaking forth of a difference, or I've been thinking of it with the concept of like contradiction, which is also really interesting in terms of the opposition, because how do you can't think a contradiction because like it isn't stable enough to think it. So it can start to appear when a tension or like an opposition becomes more and more apparent. But as soon as you get the two terms of the opposition, it's almost like the contradiction is no longer there. It's collapsed into opposing terms. They're not contradictory terms. So the collapsing into opposition is the loss of the contradiction, but at the same time, it's also a clarity on the contradiction that was there. So it's like necessarily concealed in order to think it. And it also gives you now a new conceptual space to think that space, but the act of thinking it is a concealment of what it actually was. So like the difference or whatever we're pointing to at that space is just the general concept of I think like negativity or otherness. It really is that, and it functions in this way that is super disorientating, because you left in the wake of the exposure and you're part of what gets redetermined by that wake. So you have to remember or like remember that you necessarily forget, but my language will just get kind of strange now, and maybe it's a bit to the side, but the conversation of beauty, its danger, also its value. There is a point somewhere. I mean, I guess I often just want to like tag like, because I feel a resonance with the sense that we need to think overwhelm, and specifically in the domain of beauty. And I think that's even like an opportunity. Like that's a great thing to think that we should be thinking about more. And I think something anatomical needs to come into that conversation at some point. And I know there's kind of proximity in terms of Reichian body flows and breath, but something like charge, um, and then we can say like nervous system capacity, and yes, kind of, but like there's something like an anatomical refinement of our concept in this domain, specifically around overwhelm, that I think is worthwhile, and that I think like honors the human anatomy, like that it might even be a way to gauge a health of the way in which overwhelm is interfaced, is that does it bring the organism into a greater sense of order, and not in like a tyrannical health regime kind of sense, but does it actualize more the organism, like you can get fixated on something that brings you into a state of disorder. But I also don't want to too much like fixate these words of order and disorder and harmony and health, and because there is also the intensity of a fixation or a towardsness that should disrupt those categories too. But trailing, there's something here, beauty, and then Dimitri seeded shit at the beginning, and that comes back to really like stand in your face when you've been fixated and pulled by the beauty of something, and then you stand in kind of the result of that, and it's important to I guess well, we compost that, but I'm trailing now out in thought. But there were those two directions, basically like contradiction and then anatomy in the space of beauty generally. And then I guess just to link back to the conversation with the young person who had these fixations around violence and death, it was like the productive space in the conversation would be to like bring their concept of death and negativity to something fuller and more mature, because death was already fixating them, but it was like this a very weak image of it, which meant that the way to imaginatively like engage with it was like pretty I would say like perverse or weak imagination. So it's like the best thing I could do in that situation was call them to a deeper engagement with that concept. There's some danger in that if it isn't done well, but also like the kind of the phrase that has been with me all week is like there really is no way except through, and then in the intensity of that kind of engagement, like that really became quite pronounced this week. Let me leave it there.
Oh, thank you for sharing all that, Daniel, and I'll throw it to Ebert. Well, thinking of saturation, there is an interest, and I know Mr. Ebert has pointed this with, say, Osho, and getting really, really sad, and that actually can bring you out of it. So likewise, some things you're fixed on, what it can be is like, no, get more fixed on death, like really saturate the notion of death. Often, and funny enough, sometimes what I found, I guess, with just creative writing and Butler and different things, that a way that you can deal with fixation is actually making the person really describe it to themselves, like in detail, not general language, but like real description, like detail, and like go through the language of really describing it. Because like we talk about with Robert Olin Butler, is often our language is full of abstractions. When we talk about a hay bale, we say hay bale. No, there's no hay bale. There's just the straw on your fingers, the kind of the smell of it, the cold dew in the morning, tied in the hay bale threading. And what you're doing is you're actually like really increasing the ways that you relate to the thing. And that actually, once you do that, because of kind of the burden it takes to really fully describe the thing to you, it can actually kind of free you from it in a certain way. And so likewise, if someone is fixed on video games, something that can be good is say, okay, play them nonstop, like really play them. And I know Cadell has made this point as well. And that actually can kind of break it out, right? That there's this kind of saturation that occur, which is interesting. It depends. I guess I'm also taken by what you were saying of this collapse into opposites. I think that definitely happens, and that kind of breaks the tension, or you encounter difference and frame it as an opposite. So you kind of distance it when you make it an opposite. It's opposed to you. It's away from you. It's opposite. When really a difference is something you hold in relation. And I guess I'm also thinking, like there's something about difference. Yeah, I mean, I see in the chat talk on saturation, which I know Mr. Ebert talks on well. There is something about in a relationship, there's a certain passage of time and exchange of language and saturation that actually affords the emergence of the difference and kind of perhaps even creates it. And there's a question in the relationship on, did the relationship create the difference, or was the difference always there that you then just didn't realize? Right. And that question can bother couples in some respects, but at least regardless of which direction it comes from, the realization that there's something about a relationship that is precisely the encounter of difference and the handling it that can only occur in the relationship through time and the continual relating that actually gives rise to the difference. And then based on how you respond to it, that kind of retrospectively determines the quality of the relationship that was always already there, right? Like if when Michelle is Michelle as a definitive person, if you can't handle that, then it's kind of in a sense as if you were never relating to them, right? So the difference has this kind of retrospective quality to it that is, I think, very, very powerful. That then kind of, it's just very interesting because my mind is like really, like, as you know, and then I'll pass it to Ebert here, I'm always interested in encounterology, like the surprise, and locating philosophy in that, or thought in that very moment. What happens in the moment when difference arises? Not the concept, like in the moment when difference occurs, when Michelle is different in definitive. What is going on when we use terms like being, becoming, dialectic, lack, excess, beauty? Like what happens in that moment? And to really think all of those things relating in different ways, right? Is it an experience of lack? Is it an experience of creation? Is it like in a delusion? Is it an experience of difference? Like what happens in that moment? Because part of the issue is it seems like tears, which are both sadness and happiness at the same time, to the bite, boom, there's this boom that occurs. So before I keep going down that road, I'll stop and give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, good to have you, sir.
Hey, gangs. Javier, sorry, I've still been sick, so I didn't even read your email yet, but I'll look at it. I don't know if tomorrow will be good or not. We're gonna have a little smackdown on lack. God, this is a great. This is circling everything I've been just writing about and thinking about recently. I want to start by saying that when I learned that I was going to die around the age of 5, I I started behaving self-destructively from then on, really, until I developed a heroin addiction, and then finally sort of like came out of that, confronted death, and then I found that I didn't need the program or anything like that, and so on and so forth. And I just don't. I don't think I could get addicted to something if someone like grain fed me heroin. I just don't. That's my fantasy. But truly, like I've confronting death somehow did it, right? I think that there's something about our fears, let's say lack, for instance, where we want to run toward it, and we want to make it the constitutive element in our entire philosophy because it's what drives us crazy, because it's what we fear. And so we overdetermine the extent to which the thing that we're afraid of is tied up in everything that we can see. in order to confront it and overcome it and sublate it in some sense. So when I see, I guess that's enough to say about that. I'll save the rest for our conversation. And Javier, sadly, you're going to have an inside edge on me because I've been spilling all my beans on IDW. So I'm sure you'll be able to sort of counter me quite handily by the time we talk. But I'm down for that. I want to be picked apart. I wanted to also just mention, I don't know if Luber's still on here. Yeah, he is. Okay, so. And Daniel, you've been hinting at this whole time. There is a function which automatically turns fixation on a determinate object into an experience of indeterminacy, which itself is overwhelming by definition, and then which overwhelm produces the sensation or experience, phenomenology of lack through a sort of phenomenology, because you're experiencing this sort of saturative absence. Which then propels the hunt for determinate objects all over again, right? So the function that I believe Luber was asking about is embedded in the dialectic as the function of sublation. Sublation does not have a positive valence. It's not negative. It's ambivalent, and it is both a saturation and the destruction of relation through the completion of relation, if you like, just to use a dicey term like completion. It is the saturation of epistemology, the saturation of relation, the saturation of determinacy, right? So we fixate on something. We produce, I mean, one of the reasons we fixate on something is effectively to have a spiritual experience. And that's the synthomic project, right? That is the idea of cascading into an omega point, where like repetition, and this occurs all over the place. One other random thought I had about sort of perversion is that there's something about, obviously, the perverted object, which is outside of the Lakoff framing. And because it's outside of the Lakoff framing being the series of concepts that are within the box of acceptable ideation, because it's outside of that, it's socially beyond. And you then feel like you have a one-to-one relationship with this thing because it's a secret relationship, because it is a disapproved relationship, because you're having it in private. And it's interesting that like we might feel shame after, like Dimitri was saying that he, feels shame typically after masturbating, which I think I understand what he's talking about, but again, to then transpose an experience that we have and universalize it as fundamental or constitutive of our entire philosophy now, because that's the thing we happen to be grappling with in the moment, I think is not necessarily correct. Like I've definitely masturbated and not felt shame, and that's not because I'm sociopathic, right? But that would be the claim of a Lacanian, right? I can't experience the shame of perversion, and so I don't even really get to relish in perversion if I can't feel the shame, probably Zizek would say. Anyway, I guess that's all I have to say on that. But to say that again, just in a phrase, thought converges on thoughtlessness. That is an edict of efficiency. It is an edict of Fristonian free energy minimization. Thought must converge on thoughtlessness in order to think efficiently. And so thoughtlessness is where we want to be, right? We want to be in the zone so when we fixate, we're working on being thoughtless. And it's precisely getting to a state that is isomorphic with overwhelm. When we talk about overwhelm, it's a difficult term because we can mean something that isn't schematizing properly and is causing distress. But we can also very well mean something that has just graduated from determinacy into a temporary indeterminacy, which is granting us that sort of psychic refrain from ordinary time and graduation into ritual time temporarily. So anyway, yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Well, I hope you feel better, and that was very well said. And I think you're getting at a lot that's really important. For me, increasingly more and more, and I know I say it a lot, but it almost really, really, really keeping your mind focused, fixed, if you will, on that moment where a thing becomes definitive. If you don't do that, you're going to end up reifying a single concept too much. Rather it be difference, excess, being, whatever. Like, I think the history of philosophy is often tied to a concept, I'll just say generally, as opposed to a moment, to a experience, like to this thing that occurs where all of it kind of comes together. And the question is, what moment do you focus on? And I guess what I'm saying is there's a part of me when we talk about difference, I suppose more and more the word definitive, like, capital D difference is often spoke about, like capital B being and so on. Now, Terence Blake doesn't think Deleuze should be associated so much with difference, but I think multiplicity, reasons for that are very interesting. But definitiveness, I like as a term, because definitiveness is this moment of surprise where Michelle becomes Michelle. And that, boom, that occurs. It's very mysterious. Mr. Luber, thank you for being here. There is, like you're saying, something like there's a saturation of relationship, similarity, saturation of relating, and then they're definitive. And in that definitiveness, oh, you're not what I thought you were. Oh, you're saturated, like you say. You're not what I thought you were. And that actually becomes a very critical moment in one's life when the world is definitive and more than you thought it was, where your wife is more than you thought it was. Are you glad in that? Or are you terrified in it? And that moment of the definitiveness, the surprise, and it has to be surprising. It has to be surprising. And it brings to mind what the work you've done, Mr. Ebert, on limits. They have to be encountered. They have to be surprising. So there's an encounter of limit that generates definitiveness that then that could be Lovecraftian, reduce you to ask, but it could also be beauty. And in that moment, if you really, really try to think it, and this is almost where for me, very often I feel as if theologians and philosophers can benefit from literature or art, because there's something about really keeping the description of that in mind, or the experience of that in mind, really hard. And it's really hard because you're not experiencing it right now. But if you can hold it and say, what's happening there? Does the word lack cover that? Does the word excess cover that? Yes, no, right? Like you're saying, indeterminacy, determinacy, it's all going there. And so that moment when a thing becomes definitive, like difference is in the way that Luber was pointing to, what's happening in that moment. Now, a theory I have that I cannot prove, but it's something that I think is tied to this question of desire. So this is a question I have. So you're pointing out, and then I'll give it to Michael. So you're pointing out that thought seeks thoughtlessness. Absolutely, it does. C.S. Peirce talks about that ethic of belief. No, thought doesn't. We think to not think. This is very important, and this obviously has a big impact on the belonging and sociology thinking, where that's why we're so susceptible to the Hannah Arendt banality of evil, and because we thinking has to be toward thoughtlessness. The question is the following: does the experience of definitiveness entail some sort of attraction, even pleasure in it, that actually keeps thought from thoughtlessness? Like in that experience of definitiveness, there is a certain sort of awe that entails a kind of thoughtlessness, but it almost is a new threshold, if I were to use that language, which I know we've talked about, where when you actually experience in that encounter definitiveness, that surprise, does that become almost a new basis on which thought operates? Or it could be if you're not destroyed by it, right? A reason this is, many literary writers, whether it be James Wood, speaking on Joyce, there's always this question in literature, if there is something fundamentally pleasurable about particularity, Like that's why writing that's particular is more enjoyable than writing that is general. And what Wood and other people suggest is actually there's something fundamentally enjoyable about particularity. There is something in us that actually fundamentally enjoys the experience of a particular description and the feeling of particularity. So what he's saying is that we enjoy the description of a cup as porcelain and teal and filled with lemon tea that has red pepper flakes in it, which is a secret family recipe for headaches and stuff. Yeah, I don't know if it works, but I drink it all the same. That there's a pleasure in that more than when I say a cup of tea, because that's general, right? So that the particularity actually entails an enjoyment that I'm attracted to and that actually sustains me in a certain way. Like it sustains me in the reading. When I turn Michelle into like woman into Michelle and it becomes definitive, does that actually in a certain way, and obviously I have a bias because I think it does, actually that's what thought needs to achieve to not slip into the thoughtlessness that then is kind of the Hannah Arendt banality of evil, or the thoughtlessness that is the stupidity that Bonhoeffer warns about, or the fixedness that becomes a neurotic fixedness that's very, very problematic. There seems to be something, because there almost is a difference between, I guess I want to say, the thoughtlessness of all, or almost beholding. Like there's kind of beholding. This experience of beholding has some sort of freedom of thought from itself, versus the thoughtlessness that is mere energy conserving. Now, this would only possibly make sense because by definition, thinking has to go toward something that's energy conserving almost, not ultimately, but I mean, well, ultimately, but not perhaps in moments, and that's Fitch and all that. But if actually energy is created in the experience of the definitive, if actually energy is made almost mysteriously, and Cleo and other people will talk about this, then that actually would mean that the experience of the definitive creates energy that sustains thought in the beholding of the definitive. And that seems to be something true to life, because when you have an awe experience, you feel the energy to sustain that. When you experience the fullness of another person in their definitiveness and it doesn't destroy you, that almost creates a certain energy to hold that space. And thus thought is able to find the energy that it needs to converge on to sustain itself, not from the thoughtlessness of the generality, but from the encounter of the definitiveness that it can handle. And I suppose that's the contrast. And this is where I think about the Deleuze-Lacan debate and all of that, is there is, and more must be said, and obviously this also overlaps with the Givens releases conversation, right? Because for most of history, we basically form society according to norms and givens because they're thoughtless, and you can get belonging, and they form and they work in different ways, right? But and there's something where if people don't have givens at all, it's no good. They can't handle it. So likewise, they need quote unquote something thoughtless, something that holds them, right? Thinking needs some sort of relationship with thoughtlessness. If that thoughtlessness comes from a certain givenness, then you get the pathologies that we've had in history. But if instead that thoughtlessness can actually be more of a certain sort of sustaining that arises when you encounter a definitiveness that you can handle, like is there something sustaining about beauty? Well, that will give you something like givens that you've had in history, but without the same fixedness that then goes into, it has a different quality of fixedness, if you will, that then the fixedness that in the past goes toward banality of evil and all that other stuff. That is very problematic. So that is a question that for me, I put a lot of stakes in. And I do just for, it is very interesting that there is something about encountering true definitiveness that surprises you, that if you can handle it, actually seems to generate a new kind of energy, a new kind of relation. Perhaps that is all wrong, but it is something I think about. But I will pause and throw it to Michael here. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and take a stab at, because I'm not very well read except just in how you're explaining it of thoughtlessness. But it seems to me like if you don't have a relationship with thoughtlessness, overwhelm is kind of a natural end state, right? Because thought then kind of is chasing its own tail. It doesn't have like a definite kind of uh end, or kind of like a relax, a leisure. Johannes will talk about leisure, like it doesn't have like an ultimate kind of resting place. And then it ends up kind of being like this attempt to well, I think it falls into calculation, right? Because thought then becomes how it becomes in the business of like problem solving, and I think it runs the risk of kind of I don't know, becoming kind of like game A logic based, where yeah, you can, the whole kind of analysis by paralysis like phenomenon, it is like very easy to fall into. And so if it doesn't have this relationship of like where it's ultimately going towards, like I think about who is it, like Miles Davis, who talks about learning scales and chords so that he can eventually forget them like in the improvisation, right? So it's like you do all this thinking and kind of mapping the territory to be able to encounter Michelle and to be able to like let go of that. Now you obviously still need the thinking to be able to like decide to place yourself in that situation and have the appropriate posture to hold that difference. But you have this relationship where I guess you see the limits of thinking, or you realize when it's kind of exhausted itself. And so yeah, just thinking about our conversation earlier on overwhelm, and thinking about yeah how it seems like there's a relationship between that and thoughtlessness. It also seems very tied to like apprehension instead of calculation. I had kind of a funny encounter with this. Like 10 days ago, or I don't know, a week and a half ago or something. I was on the toilet, and I just looked down at my bath mat, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's a lion's face in my bath mat, just kind of in the like, texture of it. And it was just like, it's so clear to me. Like I could like see the eyes and the nose and the mouth. And I sent it to this online literature community that I'm a part of. And it only got one comment, but like the guy who like we're very close, he was like, oh, I see it immediately. And I was like, oh, you found Waldo. He's like, no, I found Aslan. But it wasn't like, oh, I saw the eyes and I saw the nose and I saw the mouth and I like put it all together like this is a lion. Like it just immediately was apparent to me. And I've just kind of been reflecting on that with like your language of apprehension, and thinking about like how I think the temptation is to try and like kind of reverse engineer that process to like put yourself in more situations where like the lion can reveal itself, right? But it's also kind of so random, like the but it's also not totally random in the sense that I don't think everyone, given that exact moment in that exact position, would have maybe seen that. Like there is some sort of, if you're too caught up in your own thinking, or you're kind of too anxious or too overwhelmed, like maybe you wouldn't notice it. So there is kind of some training of presence involved in being able to apprehend, but also that's also no guarantee that there will be that strike, right? That there will be that strike of beauty. And so it seems like that's where faith comes in, of like putting yourself in the position where, you're writing every day, say, and like the poem just isn't coming together. It just feels like a bunch of lines. Maybe they're kind of beautiful lines on their own, but it doesn't feel like they're kind of all coming together. And to not kind of despair in that, to not crumple up the paper and throw it away, but to continue to have that like abiding belief that it will cohere at some point. And I think that is that like dialectic, right, between kind of the end state of thoughtlessness, kind of the like the finished, like, oh, I can exhale, and where you are now, and that kind of like that kind of tension and that wrestling to dwell in that difference, as opposed to seeing that as a sign that you should give up, or it's just not gonna like get birthed out of you, right? Like that's the girdle point, right? Like when you want apprehension to happen and it hasn't yet. It seems, I don't know, maybe it's just part of it, but yeah, I kind of sense I'm drifting, but yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, I think that's getting at a lot. And if anyone has any final things, please. Otherwise, I'll jump here. And I appreciate everyone being here. Well, there's some definitiveness has to be apprehended. You can't calculate your way to it. It just suddenly is there. And that can be a point of saturation and boom. Then you have it. And it would also have to certainly be in the girdle point, because your map can't be definite. Your map can't entail, here's the funny thing, a map in the map doesn't entail anything definitive, because that's the territory by definition. And yet your map is necessary for the territory to be intelligible. But the point of the map are these moments of indefinitiveness. The definitive is for these points of the indefinitive, right? Of which thought, but then there's this weird thing of which the definitive then falls back into the definitive and all of that lovely stuff. But that fix it, unfix, fix it, unfix, fix it, unfix, that's the point of a map. Not to fixed, but to actually create almost that topography, I almost want to say, of that occurrence. And that's what a map can do if it owns its girdle point, if it realizes that the point of the map is the girdle point, which then is where something can be definitive. And the map may actually habituate you into the capacities necessary to encounter the territory, right? Because there's this idea that the map isn't the territory, but does that mean the territory can't be walked? Well, we all know you can walk a territory without a map. So in a sense, you don't need a map. But in another sense, there's this idea that if you never have a map, then the territory will destroy you, or so is the notion, or ultimately will destroy you. And that your brain wants a map. I mean, that goes to what Ebert is saying. It's going to make a map. Dang it, it's going to fall back into one. But does that mean you can't encounter the territory at all in any sort of sense? Well, that's the definitive moment, right? That's that kind of moment of definitiveness that can occur. And so this becomes, I guess, the question that I think about. Not that I have all the answers of it, but because I think this energy constraint, this notion that thinking we tend toward saving energy generally. Like we tend toward using less energy. And if you didn't, you would be overwhelmed, right? So the question is, every time you encounter something definitive, which is very hard and takes a lot of work to actually encounter a definitive that you can handle. So let's say energy conservation, I'll just say that, is here. Okay, it's here. And then you encounter a definitiveness. And this may overlap with what Mr. Ebert is saying on sublation based on the end of Doctrine of Being, is that you have the energy conservation is here, but if you can encounter a definitive you can handle, does it in a sense raise it, right? And so now the baseline of energy conservation is in a way, I want to say higher. And by higher, I mean closer to the definitive, right? And thus the territory in a certain sense, right? And then if you can handle another definitive encounter, there's another kind of baseline and another kind of baseline that occurs where once you able, because an encounter of a definitiveness is very, very energy intensive, right? It's really, really hard. And if you choose to go back to energy conservation by abandoning that energy intensive challenge, you go back to your previous baseline. But I guess what I am saying, and I don't know, is that it seems to me as if there's an energy conservation on the other side of that energy intensive experience that then has a different quality of energy conservation. Like the way you conserve energy is now different. It is more in terms of that definitive character. So perhaps another way to put it that may be right or wrong. I know Mr. Ebert has talked about drunk or monk, where the monk looks like the drunk guy and the drunk guy looks like the monk, right? Is there some sort of sense, and this doesn't perfectly map on, but is there some sort of sense that every time you manage to be a monk, even if after you become a monk, if you fall back on the drunk, it's now instead of, so we could say drunk one, monk one, and let's say you're a monk. Well, then the next time you fall back on a drunk, it's drunk two, not drunk one. Yeah, it's drunk, but it has a different quality to it. It's drunk two. And then you manage to do monk two, but you fall back on the drunk. Well, now it's drunk three, not drunk one. You see what I'm saying? There's some sort of saturation, some sort of actually qualitative transformation that occurs every time you can handle a definitive experience, right? And if indeed constant experience of Michelle becomes Michelle, that quantity, quality. So you have that move that's going on, which then means there's new qualities that can quantify to a new quality, on and on and on and on. And that these new qualities are in relation to the definitiveness. That is what the new qualities are toward, this sort of definitiveness, this one of oneness. That is this simultaneous, that has to be apprehended, not calculated. And yet calculation is what makes possible that apprehension because it creates the environment to where it can occur. And every time that apprehension occurs, are you actually able, because there is a certain suggestion of an advancement here, a certain kind of advancement in virtue or what have you, are you actually, every time you experience a definitiveness you can handle, are you actually in the future then able to use less energy to experience that same amount of definitiveness than before you could handle that definitiveness? You see what I'm saying? Because if that's the case, then even though you never get away from the fact that thinking, and you could say the subject in general, is always trying to conserve energy, you nevertheless, every time you handle definitiveness, the conserving of energy on the other side of that is not the same as the energy conserving on if you would have run from it, right? And I do from experience think that's true. I do think from experience believe that's true, but that could be anecdotal. Because you can conserve energy by not using it, but there's also a way which you can maintain the same quantity of energy by creating it. And the question is the following: does experiences of definitiveness create energy? Not merely rearrange it, but in some sort of deep negentropic way, create energy. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does. But I think when people discuss that kind of beauty of the surprise or Dante with Beatrice, there's some sort of suggestion of a negentropic possibility that then changes the way that our mind rests in Sabbath on the other side of that definitiveness versus how do we run from it. But much more would have to be thought on that. It's good to see everyone. Thank you, Mr. Ebert. Good to see you. Michael, Thomas, Daniel, Christian. Thank you all for coming on this fine day. And may you have a wonderful day. All the best.